Many people have wondered what would happen if all the glacial ice on the planet melted. Some believe that it would be a water world with no land in sight, while others think that could never happen. But the Earth is changing in more ways than you might think on its own. Many might wonder how much of the Earth's current global warming trend is affected by humans. Regardless of who is to blame, whether the planet is just going through a natural phase in its evolution, or if we are responsible, the evidence shows that the planet is getting warmer and warmer every year. But just how much of the planet could end up covered in water if all the glacial ice melted? Well, it turns out that all the ice melting would just be the beginning of our problems, as many more catastrophic things would happen. You all probably know by now that about 71% of the Earth's surface is already covered in water. But it wasn't always this way. Between 2.4 and 2.1 billion years ago, the planet's water was frozen in an ice age called the Huronian glaciation. The early stages of this ice age was severe, and the entire Earth was frozen over like a giant snowball. This was likely triggered by a 250 million year lull in volcanic activity. Less carbon dioxide in the air meant a reduced greenhouse effect, resulting in a much colder climate. The interesting thing is that during the 200 million years of the Cryogenian period, the Earth was plunged into the deepest cold that it had ever experienced. And it is theorized that the emergence of complex life may have caused this. The theory is that this glaciation was triggered by the evolution of large cells and possibly multicellular organisms. These organisms would have sunk to the seabed floor after perishing, sucking all the CO2 out of the atmosphere, further weakening the greenhouse effect, which lowered global temperatures even more. Yes, even in theory, life forms can cause a global ice age. There is evidence that the planet's ice came and went in regular cycles, and that it's possible that it was driven in changes in the Earth's orbit, as well as what happened on the surface of the planet. When plants emerged and started to cover the Earth, they too pulled the CO2 out of the atmosphere. The reason we mention all of this is that regardless if we are or aren't responsible for the Earth's warmer climate today, evidence shows that the Earth goes through its own cycles of on and off ice ages. But it also proves that life can be responsible for changes in global temperature. The Arctic isn't the same as it was today as it was, say, 100 years ago. Temperatures there have been rising at twice the normal rate, which has been sparking some very alarming changes, unlike anything seen in recorded history. 87% of Antarctica Peninsula glaciers have melted since 1945. Now the region's sea ice is declining by 13% each decade. Scientific predictions that foresaw an ice-free Arctic Ocean during the summer between 2040 and 2050 may come to pass even sooner than we thought. The reason is that satellite estimates for sea ice thickness were overestimated by 25% due to the saline properties of the snow cover on top of the ice, which affected the accuracy of the readings. With that in mind, we can expect the ice to melt much sooner, and that's a scary thing. The oceans are also soaking up more heat. If the oceans become too hot, they will be unable to support marine wildlife because of the decline in oxygen. If all the glacial ice from the poles and the mountaintops melted right at this moment, ocean and sea levels would rise by more than 215 feet. There would be new shorelines, and many places on Earth would go underwater. A lot of people will think, well, that's no big deal. Just get everyone to move to higher ground. Sounds like a simple solution. However, aside from the fact that billions of people would be displaced, there would be more to worry about now that all the Arctic ice has melted. What is not commonly known is that the Earth's poles not only get less direct sunlight than lower latitudes, but the sea ice is white and therefore reflects most of the sunlight that hits back out into space. That reflectivity, called albedo, keeps the poles cold and limits the heat absorption from the sun. That sea ice also influences the ocean's currents, which have a big effect on our weather. The reason is that oceans and air act like heat engines, which move heat to the poles in a constant quest for balance. Ocean currents move this warmer water along what you would call a global conveyor belt in a process known as thermohaline circulation. Without getting too technical, warming up the poles would disrupt Earth's overall heat flow, throwing weather out of control. It's no surprise that global warming has boosted severe weather in general over the decades. Massive hurricanes could form because there would be no sea ice, which limits the amount of moisture that moves from the ocean into the atmosphere. And super tornadoes, more powerful than any ever recorded, would touch down in many parts of the world. Another thing that sea ice does is insulate the air. It does this by limiting how much of the planet's warmth rises up to the surface and from the warmer water entering the poles. When sea ice melts and cracks, it becomes dotted with gaps, which lets this heat escape. But that's not all. Scientists have known for a long time that Arctic tundra and marine sediments contain large frozen deposits of methane gas, which, if released into the atmosphere, will increase greenhouse gases. So, as the Arctic sea ice melts, this source of methane will increase. Think runaway greenhouse effect, which likely helped destroy the atmosphere on Mars, along with the solar winds that strip the planet of its atmosphere. All native forms of wildlife, including polar bears and Arctic seals, which use the sea ice for everything from giving birth to using it as cover to catch their prey. Walruses also use the sea ice as a place to gather. With the sea ice gone, it would force them to overcrowd beaches, and they would have to swim farther to find food. Ice-free waters also absorb more CO2, which makes the ocean more acidic, reducing its carrying capacity for calcium carbonate that shellfish and corals need to build their shells and skeletons. The 9 million people who live in the Arctic would now have to contend with coastal erosion, thawing permafrost, warmer temperatures, and changes in the animal and plant species that some traditional lifestyles depend upon. But that's not all. During this time, there could be massive earthquakes if the ice melted fast enough. One of the more uncommonly known things is that all that ice has some serious weight and suppression to it, and it has been holding down the Earth. And global warming has already bled the frigid continent of about 2.7 trillion tons of ice, with over half of those losses occurring in the last 5 years. This loss of ice has already raised global sea levels by almost a half an inch. That doesn't sound like much until you realize how much ice has already melted. The Pine Island, Thwaites, Haines, Smith and Kohler glaciers, located in the Amundsen Sea embayment of West Antarctica, have all risen by a process called glacial isostatic adjustment. As the ice thins, the land immediately underneath the ice sheet quickly springs back in response to the loss of weight. A study showed that as the glaciers of Antarctica retreat, the land beneath is rising up 5 times faster than anyone thought, meaning that in 100 years, the land will be up 32 feet higher than it is today. And here is what it looks like. The amount of ice that has melted since 1992 until now has increased exponentially, and it is estimated that the rate of ice loss is 219 gigatons per year. That's 219 billion metric tons. That's a huge number to wrap your mind around. But we can use Olympic-sized swimming pools which require 2,500 metric tons of water to fill. Every second, Antarctica loses roughly triple this mass. This means that every 40 hours, Antarctica loses 1 gigaton, or 1 billion tons of ice. That's enough to fill 400,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools, which, if you put to scale, would equal New York's Central Park. Now imagine that for this 25-year period between 1992 and 2017, that Antarctica lost 109 gigatons of ice per year. That adds up to 2,710 gigatons of ice that is turned to water. You might be wondering if there's anything you can do to help stop global warming. Most climate scientists agree the main cause of the current global warming trend is human expansion of the greenhouse effect. Warming that results when the atmosphere traps heat radiating from Earth towards space. The industrial activities that our modern civilization depends upon have raised atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from 280 parts per million to 400 parts per million in the last 150 years. The United Nations said that a scientific panel concluded that there is a 95% probability that human-produced greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, have caused much of the observed increase in Earth's temperatures over the last 50 years. Some of the things you can do are to buy anything reusable and be conscious of garbage and waste, and try to recycle everything. Saving gas by walking more or taking the bus can help, as well as planting trees. But it takes more than just a handful of people to make a change. It takes everyone to make an impact. Perhaps humanity will embrace this global threat on our planet, and governments will act fast enough to possibly reverse the damage. And for those people who procrastinate, the time for action is now, because we may just have an ally in our own sun. A periodic solar event called a grand minimum could overtake the sun perhaps as soon as 2020 and last through the year 2070. The results of this are diminished magnetism, infrequent sunspot production, and less ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth, all bringing a cooler period to the planet that may span 50 years. The last time this happened was during the mid-17th century. It was called the Maunder Minimum and lasted between 1645 and 1715. During a longer span of time, when parts of the world became so cold that the period was called the Little Ice Age, which lasted from about 1300 to 1850. However, scientists have said we are unlikely to see the return of the extreme cold from centuries ago. But in the case of global warming, all of mankind should take advantage of any help we can get. It was Lyndon B. Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, who was quoted as saying, "If future generations are to remember us with gratitude rather than contempt, we must leave them a glimpse of the world as it was in the beginning." We hope you enjoyed the video. Do you have any idea on how we could stop global warming? Let us know in the comments. It's not known exactly when us humans began to imagine being able to live forever, but it's probably been thought about for thousands of years, since getting old comes from a whole list of problems associated with it. The ancient Greek poet Homer called old age loathsome, and the well-known Shakespeare termed old age as a hideous winter. There are many scientists and researchers who believe that soon discoveries will be made that lead to immortality, and that maybe even stem cell research could reverse the effects of aging, since it has great potential. Believe it or not, it's not known exactly why we age. It just happens, and it's part of life. Researchers are still trying to understand what actually causes us to grow old and wither away, and have looked at aging as if it were a disease. But is it possible to achieve immortality? There are many scientists who say that it's just a matter of time. In fact, the tech giant Google says that we will probably find out the secret to eternal life by the year 2029. This is the time when it is estimated that nanobots will be created that will be able to swim through our bodies and fight disease. Even more unbelievable is that Ray Kurzweil, who is Google's director of engineering, says that medical advancements and technology will advance so much in the next 10 years that we may see human beings given the option to live forever. It's a pretty bold statement unless you understand the concept of medical nanobots. The microscopic bots could one day be used as drug capsules that directly target the disease and deliver the cure without affecting the entire body. Some scientists claim that eventually we will be able to inject tiny nanoscale machines into our bodies that act like tiny pharmaceutical labs. These tiny robots would be able to detect a problem inside of your body, process your body's natural enzymes and proteins into a drug, then deliver it to a problem spot. Imagine never being sick again. Nanotechnology is already capable of some incredible things. At the same time, there are some scientists that say it's impossible to biologically live forever because our bodies would age no matter what. Research suggests that by solving one problem, the human body ends up with another. There is a normal cell cycle in our body, and if good cells are boosted, then cancer cells have a better chance to grow, and even more violently. Well, even if they are, there are other ways to become immortal. Cryonics is something that has been around for decades, and is the science of freezing the body of a person using ultra-cold temperatures, stopping decay and putting everything on hold. No, it's not science fiction, and shouldn't be confused with cryo-sleep you see in the movies. With cryonics, the idea is to bring the person back from the deep freeze when the medical technology becomes available. As we mentioned before, some believe medical science will advance so much in the next decade or so that people who are cryogenically frozen could be brought back to life and have their health problems cured. At this point, they could live forever. Until then, the person stays frozen inside of a deep freeze chamber. Imagine being in one of these chambers for 100 or maybe even 1,000 years, and then being brought back to life in an unknown future where anything could be possible. Of course, the procedure of preservation is experimental, and no one knows if it will be possible to bring someone who has been frozen back to life. But if you are interested, there is a company that was founded in 1972 called Alcor, where you can become a client of this company, and when something happens to you, the company immediately steps in as soon as possible to preserve your body and your brain. Apparently, it's really easy to become a member, and if you are in good health and have life insurance, it will pay for your cryopreservation. With things being that easy, maybe many of us will end up frozen and waiting until it's possible to become immortal. Interestingly enough, there was a book published in 1986 called Engines of Creation, which focuses on nanotechnology. In this book, the author predicted that by 2040 to 2050, that the first humans will be cryonically brought back to life. But stem cell researchers think that it could be a lot sooner than that. The breakthroughs in the field have been incredibly astounding, and stem cells can be used to cure almost anything, grow new organs, and even cure baldness. Despite being in the infancy of stem cell research, the results from this alone have been shocking. As far as how many people are actually cryonically frozen, but at the Cryonics Institute in Michigan, there are nearly 2,000 people signed up to be frozen immediately after they pass away. And as of January 2018, there were 160 patients already frozen in tanks of liquid nitrogen. And for the record, for those who are curious, the first human ever frozen by cryonics was Dr. James Bedford, who passed away in 1967 and is still in his cryonic chamber after 50 years. The big question one needs to ask themselves is, do I really want to live forever? Imagine the things that would be able to be accomplished if you could live as long as you wanted to. Of course, there is that whole afterlife thing that a lot of people believe in. What if there is some existence when we leave our bodies and we don't want to come back? Some of you may think that it will be impossible to bring a frozen person back to life. However, some cool technology has come from the science of cryogenics. Some doctors have come up with a procedure which removes all the blood from a wounded person's body and replaces it with a really cold saline solution, which drops the body's temperature to around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Right now, you're probably saying that's impossible to remove all the blood from a human body and survive. However, this procedure called emergency preservation and resuscitation, or EPR, cools the body down to the point our cellular activity stops and cells can survive without oxygen. In a state of hypothermia, the human body's need for oxygen dramatically decreases. First, the solution is quickly pumped through the large aorta, through the heart and towards the brain first. Then the solution is pumped into the rest of the body. This puts the body in a state of suspended animation and can give doctors a couple of hours to save a person who has fatal wounds. Once the damage is repaired, the saline solution is replaced with the patient's blood, where the heart should start on its own. And if it does not, then the doctors will resuscitate the patient with a heart-lung bypass machine. Sounds scary, and apparently no humans have undergone the procedure, even though some testing was recently cleared. We will surely hear more of this in the future. But what about our consciousness? First of all, no one has suitable definition for what consciousness is, even though there have been many things written about it. But there are some who believe that we will soon be able to transport our consciousness to a computer, and even a prediction that we will create a perfect robot body that would be a beautiful and elegant, super powerful body without a brain. The idea is to then extract our brain tissue, neuron for neuron, and duplicate it with transistors, and there would be one of these transistors for every neuron we take out of our brain. Basically, it would be uploading our brain, our memories, and our consciousness to a machine. Imagine going through this procedure and being fully conscious as this was happening, with part of our brain working in our body and another part working in a robot. Of course, you would be connected by wires until the process was completed, and soon you would have a human body with no brain, and the perfect silicon and steel robot would be complete. This is just one of the more ambitious ideas of moving human consciousness into a machine. One of the others is uploading our consciousness into a computer. There are people now who are trying to unlock the secrets of the brain and then make it possible to upload that person's mind into a computer, which would free them of their biological body. All of the evidence, in theory, says that this is possible, although it's extremely difficult at the present time. That's because we simply don't have the technology to map the whole human brain. Of course, there are others who say that the human brain cannot be replicated because you cannot code all of the emotional things that makes us human. The interesting thing about this whole process is that if it were possible to digitize human consciousness, you would be able to move between bodies, both real and synthetic. Imagine being able to be transferred to any machine or body that you want. That is assuming no one else is there or has already left. Millions of dollars have been spent on the technological ideas that promise that one day our brains will be turned digital. It is an absolutely fascinating thing that all of us will eventually experience what happens after we leave this earth. Maybe there is some kind of glorious afterlife where only our spirit can live, or even perhaps scarier, maybe when we pass away, it's as if we simply flipped off the light switch. There are a lot of questions when it comes down to being immortal. If you could suddenly live forever, have your brain moved into a robot, or upload your consciousness into a computer, would you do this? What about your family and your friends? What if they weren't coming along? We hope you enjoyed this video. Let us know in the comments if you would want to be immortal, why, and what you would do. The moon has had a profound effect on the Earth and has shaped the entire evolution of the planet since it was formed 4.5 billion years ago after a planetoid crashed into the Earth. The moon has been there in orbit ever since, pulling on the oceans and seas, creating a tidal bulge, and literally stirring life into creation. So what if we nuked it? Blowing up the moon would have some dire consequences for our planet, somewhat like the film Oblivion, where aliens decide the best way to take us out is to destroy the moon. You might not know this, but Russia and the United States both had plans to nuke the moon. Back then, the political and cultural tensions between the United States and Russia made such desperate plans seem almost reasonable. In 1958, the Armor Research Foundation developed a plan to nuke the moon with guidance from the United States Air Force. The plan was said to be a study of the possible effects of nuclear detonation on the lunar surface and to ultimately judge the effectiveness of nuclear weapons in space. It actually turns out that both sides wanted to explode a nuclear weapon on the surface of the moon as a show of force and strength. We might have not known about all of this if it wasn't for Carl Sagan, who was working on a classified project to detonate a nuclear device on the moon. The Russians also had their own plan called the E Project. Of course, none of this happened, and we ended up sending a man to the moon instead. So the idea of nuking the moon isn't a new idea. The question is, why would you want to nuke the moon? And what would happen if we could? Many of you probably already know that we simply don't have the technology to blow up the moon. Even if we used all the nuclear devices we had, the very worst that might actually happen is the moon would probably be in smaller pieces that would eventually reform again, although it would look a lot different than it does now in the night sky. But just for the sake of an experiment, let's just say we had the capability. As for why anyone would want to nuke the moon, that would be the million-dollar question. Losing the moon would not have any positive effects on our planet. In fact, the moon is responsible for more than you might think. It turns out that our moon does a lot more than just give us light at night. Impact craters on the moon show that our lunar satellite has taken a few blows from asteroids that might have hit the Earth instead. Even if the Earth survived the effects of the moon being blown up, other space rocks could now hit the Earth, but that's just the beginning. Without the moon, there would be a lot of negative effects on the planet, depending on the way the moon exploded and which direction the pieces decided to go. Destroying the moon would result in approximately 7 × 10⁻22 kilograms of debris, which hopefully wouldn't hit the Earth in large chunks. But since the moon is kind of close to the Earth, you can bet that a lot of that debris is going to impact the Earth. You might be wondering how many nukes you would need to blow up the surface of the moon. Using some fancy online tools, it has been estimated that if the moon was blown up using nuclear weapons, it would take 9,000 15-megaton nuclear bombs, like the Castle Bravo bomb. If such an explosion combined were to happen at the same time, there would be big chunks of the moon flying through space, and a lot of those pieces would head straight for Earth. There is a good chance that many of the pieces would be big enough to cause major catastrophic damage and hit the mainlands. There would be a rain of rock on the Earth from the exploded moon. It might take days for some of the pieces to reach us, but they would be visible from the sky as they hurtled towards the Earth. It is safe to say that the majority of the devastation on Earth would come from the debris of what was left of the moon. Rocks don't need to be huge to create massive damage. Consider the Chelyabinsk meteor, which entered the Earth's atmosphere undetected because it was hidden by the sun. The meteor was 66 feet in diameter and weighed 12,000 to 13,000 metric tons. The object exploded in an airburst at the height of around 97,000 feet. The explosion generated a bright flash that was brighter than the sun, and witnesses say there was intense heat. Seismic and infrasound measurements estimated the blast to be around 400 to 500 kilotons. That's 26 to 33 times as much energy released from the Hiroshima atomic bomb. Even though the bulk of the object's energy was absorbed by the atmosphere, 1,500 people were injured, mainly from shards of flying glass, as the shock wave damaged 7,200 buildings in 6 cities across the region. Now, imagine hundreds of these impacts over days or months. The devastation would be incredible, and humanity would have to seek refuge underground. A lot of this rock and debris would heat up and burn as it entered Earth's atmosphere, which would, in turn, heat up the atmosphere quickly and turn the Earth into an oven. This devastation doesn't account for the giant pieces which could be miles long in size slamming into the Earth, not to mention the other small fragments hitting the upper atmosphere and increasing the Earth's temperature. A cloud of dust would form and possibly cover the skies, blocking out all light except for the fireballs of lunar objects entering the atmosphere. And while all of this devastation is happening, there are bigger things about to happen that would change the Earth forever. The loss of the moon would affect the Earth's orbit, rotation, and wobble, and acts like a stabilizer. Without this stabilization, the Earth would begin to wobble more and more, and the seasons as we know them would cease, as the Earth would swing around the sun in an unstable and fluctuating orbit. The Earth could end up wobbling violently as it spins. The Earth might even tilt all the way over and lie on its side in relation to the sun's orbit, resulting in extreme differences in temperatures and daylight. Other times, the Earth would be straight up and down, making nights and days equally long all year round. There would be no seasons. There would be periods with extreme weather, with bigger differences between summer and winter. Thanks to our current moon, the Earth's axis stays tilted between 23 and 26 degrees, and has kept it this way even over millions of years. The tides would be tiny in comparison to what they are now, and the seas and oceans would become more calm, now dominated by the pull of the sun, which is 400 times larger in diameter than the moon, but it is also 400 times farther away. Because of the sun's distance, the pull on the tides is only 40% as strong as the pull on the Earth's oceans by the moon. When the sun and the moon line up together, the spring tides are 140% as large as a typical tide. But now, the moon is gone. The tide patterns would be a lot simpler. Marine life would disappear as we know it, as most creatures would perish without the tides. If you suddenly remove the moon, there may or may not be giant tidal waves, since the gravitational forces from the moon would suddenly be gone. If on the other hand we decided to use some kind of Death Star weapon and blow up the moon, we might avoid some devastation for the first few years until the wobble got us. No moon means the days on Earth would get much shorter during some times, with the average day being about 6 to 8 hours long. The Earth 4 billion years ago may have only had an 8-hour day because of how close the moon was. This would give you anywhere between 1,100 and 1,400 days in a year. Our days are much longer now. This is because the tidal friction provided by the moon slows down the rotation of the Earth. This means that the Earth was spinning much faster in the past. In fact, it would be about 3 to 4 times as fast, more than 4 billion years ago. Right now, the pull of the moon slows the Earth's rotation by an effect known as tidal braking. This increases our length of day 2.3 milliseconds per century, with the moon moving away from the Earth 1.5 inches every year, giving us 24-hour days. There would be a lot of dust and small rock fragments that would create a ringed system around the Earth, much like Saturn. Over time, many lunar fragments would deorbit because of the Earth's atmosphere, creating a series of impacts. But in the night sky, there would be gray rings of moon dust around the Earth. Without the moon, the night sky would be a lot darker. Moonless nights in the middle of the desert produce some of the most fantastic views of stars in the galaxy. And you can even make out the plane of the Milky Way on dark nights away from city lights, and with the moon being on the other side of the planet. Now, imagine being able to see this just about anywhere at night, away from the city. The moon actually reflects a lot of the sun's light and is the brightest thing in our current night sky. Nights would be incredibly dark without the moon to light things up. Venus is the next brightest object in the night sky at only 1/14,000th as bright as a full moon. Also, the sun would be constantly shining on us as it does, but there would be no lunar eclipses and there would be no solar eclipses. With all this scary stuff talked about, you don't need to worry. There are no plans to nuke the moon, and it would take an incredible amount of nukes and multi-stage rockets to get them there anyway, and we simply don't have the hardware. But at least now, when you look up at the night sky, the next time you see the moon, you might just have a little more appreciation for our lunar friend. We hope you enjoyed this video. Have you ever wondered if it would be possible to land on the sun? The human race is certainly capable of some amazing things, but first of all, we should mention that there is no landing on the sun, since it's mostly made up of hydrogen gas and it has no solid surface. Besides this fact, there is also the scorching temperatures to deal with, not to mention the intense radiation, solar wind, and other energy particles that come from our star. To get people there on some kind of spaceship without melting, burning, or even self-destructing would take quite a lot of technology that we currently don't have. But that doesn't mean we can't send something close to the sun to study it. Scientists have been waiting for over 60 years for technology to advance enough so that we can get a closer look. That is where the Parker Solar Probe comes in. This remarkable probe was built with cutting-edge technology that is simply incredible, and it is currently racing towards Venus, where it will begin its orbit with the star. This mission to study the sun will be one of mankind's greatest achievements. The primary goal of the mission will trace how energy and heat move through the solar corona and to try to discover what accelerates solar wind and other solar energetic particles. The probe will also measure the sun's magnetic fields. The other interesting thing that scientists want to know is why the sun's surface temperature is far less than the corona around the sun. Scientists understand that it has something to do with the sun's magnetic field that connects the sun's surface to its outer atmosphere. It's a key mystery to understanding the sun and solar physics, and with the probe's help, we're about to figure it out. What we do know is that the sun is basically a big hydrogen gas fusion bomb, 93 million miles away from Earth, with a surface temperature of 5,600 degrees Celsius, which is 4,000 degrees higher than the melting point of steel. That's 7,232 degrees Fahrenheit, with a core temperature of 27 million degrees Fahrenheit. And if you weren't just sure how big the sun is, you could fit 1.3 million Earths inside it. It's big, it's hot, and getting anywhere close to it has been a serious challenge until now. The Parker Probe, named for Professor Emeritus Eugene Parker, who predicted the existence of solar wind decades ago, was recently launched on August 12, 2018, and will become the fastest man-made spacecraft ever. It will swoop into the sun's corona quickly and then back out while collecting data. Over a 7-year period, the probe will fly closer to the sun than any other spacecraft. It will gain the speed it needs using the gravity of Venus during 7 flybys over the course of 7 years. That will eventually bring the probe within 4 million miles of the sun's surface, on the same distance from the sun as the planet Mercury. Think of this maneuver like a gravity assist or a slingshot around the planet, and each time getting closer to the sun, and it's going to be traveling very fast. For the record, the current fastest spacecraft, defined by its heliocentric velocity, is held by Helios 2, as it was last seen moving away from the Earth at a speed of 221,232 miles per hour. But the Parker Probe, on its final orbit, will be hurtling around our star at an astounding 430,000 miles per hour. However, it's currently traveling at 38,000 miles per hour, which is less than 10% of its peak speed. But in the end, it will be going so fast that it will leave other spacecraft eating metaphorical dust. The spacecraft is supposed to go into its first orbit with the star on November 2018 and get closer to the sun on 24 different approaches, each one swinging it closer into the sun's atmosphere or the sun's corona. The glowing halo of plasma extends about 5 million miles into outer space around the sun. It's a bit hard to see unless you're using a coronagraph or looking at the sun during a total solar eclipse. The probe will have to withstand incredible amounts of heat and radiation, but it will zip towards the sun to measure and gather data. The probe will also have to withstand being bombarded by tiny fast-moving particles, some of which will hit the spacecraft. To fix this problem, the Parker probe is fitted with Kevlar blankets to protect itself from impacts. During the probe's close approach, the sun will appear 25 times wider to the probe than when it left the Earth, and it will also be 625 times brighter. We told you that the Parker probe is moving really fast, but to give you a better idea, we'll explain that. You probably know that the closer things are in orbit around any object with mass, the faster it needs to travel with respect to the object in order to stay in orbit. If the object is going too slow, the gravity will pull the object towards it and, well, that would be the end of our Parker probe. The Parker Solar Probe will end up reaching speeds of 125 miles per second. The circumference of the Earth is almost 25,000 miles in diameter. This means that if the Parker probe were in orbit around the Earth, it would make one full trip in just 3.3 minutes. To give you an idea of just how close the probe is going to get to the sun, if our Earth was at one end of a yardstick and the sun on the other, the Parker Solar Probe will come within 4 inches of the solar surface. You're probably wondering by now how something could survive such a close encounter with the sun. After all, there are a lot of expensive and sensitive instruments aboard the probe. In order to grasp this, we need to understand the concept of heat versus temperature. We won't give a full lecture because that would take a few hours. But in space, temperature can be thousands of degrees without providing significant heat to a given object. Temperature measures how fast particles are moving, and heat measures the total amount of energy that they transfer. Particles in space might be moving fast with high temperature, but if there are very few of them, they won't transfer much heat energy. We know that space is mostly empty, and with that, there are few particles that can transfer energy to the probe. For example, the sun's corona has an extremely high temperature, but very low density. If you are still confused, think about the difference between putting your hand in hot water versus putting your hand in a hot oven. But please, don't try this at home. In the oven, your hand can withstand the hot temperature a lot longer than in the water, where it's interacting with more particles. Even though the probe will be traveling through space with temperatures of several million degrees, the surface of the heat shield will only need to handle 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. If you want to compare that temperature to something, volcanic eruptions can be between 1,300 and 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, that is still very hot, and the probe needed a shield to protect it. To withstand all that heat and protect the solar probe's instruments, a shield known as a thermal protection system, or TPS for short, was used for the probe to protect it from melting. The shield is 8 feet in diameter and 4.5 inches thick, and will always be pointed directly at the sun. One tiny problem or miscalculation, and the mission would be over in just seconds, without the shield stopping the heat. However, just a few inches past this shield, the spacecraft body will sit at a comfortable 85 degrees Fahrenheit. This special heat shield material was designed by the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory and built by a company called Carbon Advanced Technologies, and took 10 years to develop. The material is a carbon composite foam, which is sandwiched between 2 carbon plates. On top of the TPS is a layer of aluminum oxide, which reflects light, and a layer of tungsten between the carbon and the aluminum, so it doesn't turn gray. Alongside this is also a water-powered cooling system. This is the same material that was used as the heat shield tiles for NASA's retired space shuttle. It dissipates heat so fast that you can actually pick up a piece that is glowing hot without burning yourself. But not all the instruments will be behind the TPS shield, and one of those is the Solar Probe Cup, or Faraday Cup, which is a sensor that is designed to measure the ion and electron fluxes and flow angles from solar wind. Unique and cutting-edge technologies were needed to create this thing, so it wouldn't melt. It uses sheets of titanium, zirconium, molybdenum, with a melting point of about 4,260 degrees Fahrenheit. The grids producing the electric field are made of tungsten that has a melting point of 6,192 degrees Fahrenheit. The wiring for this instrument is really special. Regular wire would simply melt. But the team who worked on the probe grew sapphire crystal tubes to suspend the wiring, and the wire itself is made from niobium. There are several other designs on the probe to keep it sheltered from the heat. Solar panels can open and close depending on how close to the sun the probe is. The solar arrays are protected by a simple cooling system, using 2 radiators that keep the coolant from freezing. The probe is also equipped with what is called WISPR, or the Wide Field Imager, for solar probe. It will provide the clearest yet glimpse of the solar wind from within the sun's corona. Comprising 2 telescopes, WISPR sits behind the heat shield between 2 antennae from the field's instrument suite. WISPR was turned on in early September 2018 and took closed-door test images for calibration. On September 9th, WISPR's door was opened, allowing the instrument to take the first images during its journey to the sun. The field's instrument suite aboard Parker Solar Probe will capture the scale and shape of electric and magnetic fields in the sun's atmosphere. When the mission is over, the Parker Solar Probe will end up going out in style. Like Cassini plunged into Saturn's atmosphere, or the Magellan satellite became part of Venus, the Parker probe will eventually become part of the object that it went to study. Dr. Eugene Parker, for who the mission is named after, is 91 years old and hopes to see a lot of his theories proven. Interestingly enough, this is the very first NASA mission named after a living person. We have been able to measure solar wind happening near the Earth, but only after it had millions of miles to cool down and blur together. However, the very closest approach won't happen until 2024. Until then, there are sure to be a lot of answers, as well as a lot of new mysteries as humanity touches the sun. We hope you enjoyed this video. What do you think about the mission to the sun? What things would you like to discover? Let us know in the comments below. We want to thank you for watching. It's really hard for us to understand just how immense the universe is, and just how many galaxies and stars are out there. We're not sure about the exact number, because everything in the known universe slips into the darkness past the event horizon, that region of space-time beyond which events cannot affect us. For all we know, there could be an infinite number of galaxies and stars, and for the record, not all stars explode. Some just die out. But what if something strange and mysterious happened that suddenly caused all the stars in the universe to simultaneously explode? There are many different types of stars that exist in the universe. Yellow dwarf, orange dwarf, red giants, blue giants, magnetars, and neutron stars, just to mention a few. To understand what kind of fireworks we would see in the night sky, let's figure out as best as we can how many stars we would see explode and what effect it would have on our planet. If we were to look at the observable universe and count the stars, we would start with galaxies. From what we can see, there are 10 billion galaxies out there. Of course, not all galaxies are the same size, and our own Milky Way galaxy has about 100 to 300 billion stars. So if we do the math on 10 billion galaxies, with a low average of 100 billion stars, that comes out to be about 1 billion trillion stars. Now just imagine for a minute that all these 1 billion trillion stars exploded at the same time. That would be really intense. But a star has to have mass to explode, or it won't. In fact, any neutron star whose mass exceeds 3.2 solar masses will collapse and create a black hole, and some stars simply collapse into a black hole without any pyrotechnics. More on that later. But now we will still entertain this idea that they will all explode at the same time. When a star explodes, it creates one of the most powerful and beautiful explosions in space. Supernovae are relatively common. It was once thought that these were the brightest explosions in space, but recently, some astronomers have discovered mysterious explosions of stars 10 to 100 times brighter than a supernova. So how does a star go supernova? The more massive a star, the faster it burns up its supply of fuel. Hence, the shorter its life. Our own star is 4.5 billion years old at half its life expectancy, and it's been around that long because of its smaller size. It sounds a bit confusing, and you would think that the larger the star, the longer it would take to use up its fuel. However, the most massive stars can go supernova just after a few million years of fusion. This is based on the massive forces of gravity due to their sheer size, which makes them consume their fuel much faster than smaller stars. Those massive stars quickly exhaust their fuel supply and explode when the core of the star collapses in on itself. Sometimes a black hole is often accompanied by a supernova explosion, but only if it has enough mass. The core of the star may collapse to form a black hole, while the outer envelope may build up enough energy and heat during the collapse so that it goes supernova and escapes. Supernova create shock waves called galactic winds that blast out large amounts of gas and dust. These shock waves expand outward and can move as fast as 8 miles per second. These explosions emit a lot of kinetic energy into interstellar space and travel forever until they die out, which can take hundreds of years. But even a supernova isn't the most powerful explosion, as we are discovering more each day. A hypernova, or what is called a collapsar, is a very energetic supernova thought to result from an extreme core collapse scenario. In this case, a massive star, equal to 30 solar masses, collapses to form a rotating black hole, emitting twin energetic jets, and surrounded by an accretion disk. Let's say that this happened, and we were all standing on Earth and staring out into space. We might see a lot of bright flashes from stars in our own galaxy, and with so many stars exploding at once, that night sky would probably light up brighter than day. However, because the universe is constantly expanding at incredible speeds, the explosions far away from us would appear in slow motion, even though the shock waves would be traveling very fast. We would likely be watching that explosion for 10 years or more, and it would take many years before we saw all the light from these explosions in space. There are also places in the universe that are heavy with gas clouds and interstellar dust. Some of these are called star nurseries, where stars are formed. If there were an explosion in one of these areas of space, it could cause a chain reaction, where stars exploded and more stars were created from those explosions. It would be like a never-ending chain reaction. And those places where stars are born would become the brightest spots in the universe. But what about us and our own sun? We said all the stars, and ours would be no exception. That said, we probably won't be around long enough to see any of this happen. We have already dealt with powerful effects from the sun, such as solar flares and solar winds, which are produced by magnetic explosions. These magnetic explosions that produce solar flares are as powerful as 1 billion atomic bombs, and magnetar flares that release more energy than even the largest supernova explosions. In the Earth atmosphere, they fuel magnetic storms and auroras, and in fusion reactors, they are dreaded as the source of a catastrophic failure. Now, our own sun isn't going to explode, even after it uses up all its fuel. That is because it simply does not have the mass. Physicists say that our sun still has another 5 billion years left before it burns up all of its fuel, and instead of going supernova, it is now believed that it will turn into a massive ring of luminous interstellar gas, also called a planet nebula, long after its transition into a red giant. However, if the sun were suddenly to explode in a spherically symmetrical way, then according to both general relativity and Newton's theory of instantaneous force, the sun's gravitational pull on the Earth would not change appreciably until matter from the sun passed the Earth's orbit, which would be about 22 hours after the sun exploded. That's assuming it's a typical supernova explosion. This changed configuration of matter would be felt instantly at all distances from the sun. Of course, if all the stars were to explode, meaning even our own sun, the effects on the Earth would likely be catastrophic for a few reasons. The massive amount of heat and radiation from the explosion would probably boil the seas dry, and a massive electromagnetic pulse would wipe out all power and communications. The shock wave would be tremendous, and we would immediately feel the effect. The human race would never recover from such a catastrophe. So in short, we wouldn't be around long enough to see the rest of the light show in the observable universe, but it surely would be an incredible sight. Debris and dust clouds, or these galactic winds, would likely strip the Earth of its atmosphere. It might not be instantaneous, but there would be other problems that the Earth and other planets would face if our sun exploded. Newton's theory of gravity claims that if the sun were to suddenly explode, the Earth, some 93 million miles away from the sun, would instantaneously suffer a departure from its usual elliptical orbit. even though it might take light from the explosion 8 minutes to travel from Sun to the Earth. In Newton's theory, knowledge that the Sun had exploded would be instantaneously transmitted to the Earth through the sudden change in the gravitational force governing its motion. The Earth and all the other planets would fly out into space off course at 67,000 miles per hour. In fact, the entire Milky Way galaxy, which is traveling through space at an average speed of 515,000 miles per hour, would change drastically and may not even resemble a galaxy anymore once all the stars in it exploded. It would likely be the end of everything as our planet floated through cold space, or what was left of it, and our civilization. Some humans could possibly survive underground if the effects of the initial blast didn't wipe out the entire planet at once. But there is no reason to worry or become anxious over the idea of all the stars exploding in the universe, or any kind of catastrophe that would be caused by our Sun. Of course, there is always the chance of powerful solar flares, which can cause a lot of damage to our fragile planet. But our Sun has been quiet lately, and in fact, going into a solar minimum, which could last 10 years or more. There is no telling what will happen to the universe, and anything is possible when we look at the biggest mystery of all. And that is, our universe is permeated with a vast, unseen force that seems to oppose gravity. The force is known as dark energy, and is what is pushing our universe outward. It may be possible that one day, in the blink of an eye, that the entire universe could collapse backwards on itself into a tiny speck. We live in exciting times, and as technology becomes more advanced, the more we discover. We hope you enjoyed this video. Let us know what you thought in the comments. It could be said that the invention of the nuclear weapon is probably one of man's greatest achievements. But at the same time, it is also one of the most terrifying inventions ever created. Some say the threat of nuclear war is still very real, while others say that it will never happen. But just how much destructive capability would all the world's nuclear weapons have if they exploded at the same time? Robert J. Oppenheimer was the father of the atomic bomb. He was officially credited by the War Department with achieving the implementation of atomic energy for military purposes. But after he saw its devastating power, which was like nothing anyone had expected, he and others had started to question the work that they accomplished. After the successful detonation of the bomb, he made a statement in which he remembered some text from some ancient Hindu scripture, and he was quoted as saying, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was the beginning of a frightening new era, and since its invention, there has been an ongoing race to see who could build the most powerful nuclear weapon. On March 1st, 1954, on Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, the United States conducted a hydrogen bomb test that had seemingly gone out of control. This is because the bomb designers used 30% lithium-6 and 70% lithium-7 as fuel. But what scientists didn't know is that lithium-7 would be stripped of one of its neutrons early in the reaction and become lithium-6, at which point would become bond fuel. The weapon was designed to have a yield of 5 megatons, but because of the unknown reaction of lithium-7, it ended up having a 14.8 megaton yield. The crater left by the Castle Bravo test is so large that it is visible from space and was about 1,000 times as powerful as that of Hiroshima. But Russia was getting ready to show the world something of their own. The RDS-220 hydrogen bomb, also known as a Tsar Bomba, was the biggest and most powerful thermonuclear bomb ever made. It was exploded by the Soviet Union on October 30th, 1961, over Novaya Zemlya Island in the Russian Arctic Sea. It was estimated to be a 57 megaton weapon. The bomb was so big that it was said to be more constructing a small house than building a bomb. It was 26 feet long and was 7 feet in diameter, and it weighed 60,000 pounds. At the time, it wasn't possible to put this powerful of a warhead on a rocket. It was simply a true display of raw power. The Tsar Bomba was almost 4,000 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. Had the bomb been made with a depleted uranium tamper instead of a lead one, the yield would have been 100 megatons. Novaya Zemlya Island was also used for other nuclear weapons tests by the Soviet Union at the time. One of those was an underground test which involved 4 nuclear devices, totaling 4.2 megatons total yield. During this test, pressures underground from the explosion created a seismic magnitude of 6.97 on the Richter scale. This set off an 80-million-ton avalanche that blocked 2 glacial streams and created a 1.5-mile lake. Despite the dangers of natural disasters, there have been 224 nuclear detonations on the island, with a total explosive energy equivalent to 265 megatons. Despite it being the most powerful nuclear explosion, the weapon was unconventional, and the plane that dropped it had to be specifically outfitted to carry the enormous and incredibly heavy bomb over the target area. During the same time, the United States was testing another weapon. The B-41, also known as the Mk-41, was a 3-stage nuclear weapon, which was a tertiary stage bomb, meaning it had an additional fusion stage compressed by a previous fusion stage. This meant that a bomb could be made with yields as large as desired. The B-41 was 12 feet 4 inches long and was 4 feet 4 inches in diameter with a 25 megaton yield and weighed 10,690 pounds. By 1963, the United States claimed it could produce a 35 megaton warhead and put it on a Titan II, which could carry an 8,200-pound payload, which would almost double the yield-to-weight ratio of the B-41. It remains the highest yield-to-weight ratio of any weapon ever created. About 500 of these weapons were made between September 1960 to June 1962, but they have all since been retired. Despite the terrifying power of these weapons, conventional warheads that missiles are able to carry only have a yield of 1.2 to 1.5 megatons. However, one should not make the mistake thinking that this is not a powerful weapon. Some super heavy intercontinental missiles can carry any number of warheads, from a single independent warhead up to 10 warheads. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, only 9 countries have nuclear weapons. The United States has 6,450 total warheads, and Russia has 6,850, which collectively account for 92% of the world's stockpile. China has the next largest amount with 280 warheads, a tiny fraction compared to the US and Russia, and none of them are deployed. Other countries make up the rest of the 885 nuclear warheads, which are also not deployed, but locked up in some military facilities. In 1985, there were 70,000 nuclear warheads on the planet, either stockpiled or retired. Today, there are 14,465 nuclear warheads, and of these, approximately 9,335 are in the military stockpiles. The rest are awaiting dismantlement. 3,750 warheads are deployed with operational forces, of which about 1,800 U.S., Russian, British, and French warheads are on high alert, ready for use on short notice. The current largest nuclear weapon in the U.S. stockpile is a 1.2 megaton yield nuclear weapon, the B-83, and Russia has the super-heavy thermonuclear-armed RS-28 Sarmat, or as NATO designates them, the Satan II, which can be fitted with 10 750 kiloton warheads. Most warheads could either be combined on a single ICBM or fitted independently on smaller rockets. But there are other massive weapons being deployed. Based on leaked Russian documents, Canyon is a nuclear-armed autonomous torpedo capable of traveling 6,213 miles with a 100 megaton thermonuclear weapon as its payload. That's at least twice as powerful as any nuclear weapon ever tested. It's not known how many 100 megaton thermonuclear weapons exist at this point, but it is almost certain that it is being built or developed now, and Russia could already have 1 or 2. If all the nuclear bombs, including the ones locked up in bunkers, and all the warheads that are deployed in missile silos exploded, they would cause incredible damage and loss of lives, despite the fact that some warheads would be in missile silos and in storage bunkers. Some of these warheads would be in nuclear bunkers deep in the ground, and the explosions would trigger massive earthquakes. It wouldn't be much different than an all-out nuclear war, except the missiles would be in the ground. Nuclear weapons are configured to detonate in one of 2 ways, either by ground impact or airburst, where the weapon explodes when it reaches a certain altitude. Airburst nuclear explosions can create much more damage and increase the explosion pressure and damage. That is why most nuclear weapons are configured to airburst detonate. But less pressure doesn't mean less devastation. Now imagine all the nuclear weapons we have exploding at once. The initial explosions would light up and burn the areas for hours, building up enormous fires. Most heavy missiles with multiple independent warheads would vaporize inside of the silo, with the majority of the blast exiting the blast doors at the top, creating man-made radioactive volcanoes and leaving molten craters and showering the area with radioactive particles. Even a small nuclear exchange would create firestorms and wreck the planet's atmosphere. Simulations show that it would only take 115 kiloton bombs to destroy more than a quarter of the Earth's ozone layer in just 2 years. Protective gases in the atmosphere would drop, letting through harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun. The climate change would be unprecedented, and the world would shut down. Now imagine what 14,000 nukes would do. It would be a game over, even if a single missile never left a silo. In the water, nuclear weapons carried by submarines could create massive tsunamis, depending on how close to the surface or how close to the seafloor they were. It's possible that massive earthquakes and tsunamis could be triggered by such a powerful explosion. If it was only one nuclear warhead, it might not be as catastrophic. The U.S. Navy has 18 Ohio-class submarines which are capable of carrying 24 missiles, which can be configured with a maximum of 8 nuclear warheads. If you do the math, you understand how powerful a blast could be underwater. Imagine 18 submarines exploding underwater in different parts of the world at a force of nearly 230 megatons each, and this is just the U.S. Navy. But what if we took all the nuclear warheads in the world and put them in one place and detonated them? Not all warheads have the same yield, so it might be impossible to say exactly how much explosive power we would end up with. But if you consider that the average nuke is between 750 kilotons to 1.2 megatons, you would still have a large blast somewhere in the 15,000 megaton range or more. It's hard to even imagine such an explosion, which would be massive, and the light from it would travel through space. The crater left from the explosion would be massive. The amount of radioactivity that it would spread would end life as we know it in just days, depending on where the explosion was. The explosion might cause a massive tectonic plate movement, and there would be massive earthquakes and volcanoes as a chain reaction across the planet began after the explosion. All of that sounds really scary. Of course, there really isn't any way of knowing exactly what will happen, but it's likely that the Earth will survive as it goes through a nuclear winter and all life is extinguished from the massive radioactivity. Luckily, there is no way that all the nuclear weapons could be pulled to one location and then detonated unless you are Apocalypse from X-Men, so there is no need to worry. The threat of nuclear war is always ever present, and the doomsday clock sits at 2 minutes to midnight. Let's hope that it never strikes midnight. We hope you enjoyed this video.
When most people think of dangerous animals, the first things that come to mind are lions and tigers, hippos and saltwater crocodiles. While these animals are certainly dangerous, the chances of us coming into contact with one in a rural city are almost slim to none. So what really is the most dangerous animal in the world? There are the most aggressive, the most poisonous, and the deadliest animals running all over the planet, each with having their own dangerous reason of why you don't want to run into them face to face. Before we get started, make sure to click subscribe and turn on notifications so that you will be the first to know when we release a new video. If you happen to live on the continent of Africa, you probably need to watch out for another dangerous animal aside from hippos and crocodiles, the tsetse fly. It is often regarded as the world's most dangerous fly, which measures only 8 to 17 millimeters, which is about the same size as an average housefly. These flies are nasty, blood-sucking bugs that feed during the very warm hours of the day. But it's not the fact that they're little vampires that makes them dangerous. Their true terror lies in the single-celled parasites they spread, which are called trypanosomes. These microscopic pathogens cause what is called African sleeping sickness, which in turn causes neurological and meningoencephalitis symptoms and include poor coordination, behavioral changes, and disturbances in sleep cycles, which gives the disease its name. There are no vaccines or medications that can prevent infection. If it is left untreated, the disease can be fatal. There are over 10,000 fatalities per year from this tiny, pesky animal. Sometimes, you end up getting surprised when you find out something about a typically normal creature and learn that it's more dangerous than you possibly imagined. We're talking about freshwater snails. You heard that right. Those harmless-looking things, slowly crawling around in your garden, are actually dangerous. Parasitic flatworms cause a disease called cystomysiasis, which does really nasty things to the human body. The surprising thing is that you might think you would need to eat some snails raw to become infected. Not so. The parasite infects the snail where it breeds and reproduces, and then leaves the snail entering the water. The parasite can only live for 48 hours without a human host. But when a host is found, the worm enters the blood vessels and for several weeks will stay there while developing into an adult. Meanwhile, the symptoms for the host aren't nice. When the worms reach maturity, they lay more eggs and the process starts over. If the eggs do not leave the body, they can become ingrained in the body tissues and cause a variety of problems, including intense abdominal pain, among a long list of other bad symptoms. You might think that this would be a rare occurrence for someone to become infected by this parasite. However, millions of people contract this infection every year, and between 20,000 and 200,000 fatalities can be attributed to cystomysiasis. Every year, there are 35,000 human fatalities caused by this animal, which is also well known as man's best friend. You heard that right, dogs. You might not think they are man's best friend after hearing this. They are high on the list of the most dangerous animals on the planet. However, there have been many dog attacks on humans, and you've probably even heard stories of these animals turning on their owners. Lately, there have been more stories about dogs mauling their owners, dogs escaping their yards, and even stray dogs in neighborhoods attacking innocent people. This happens more often than you know, and it's usually the powerful dog breeds such as pit bulls, or most recently, a terrible fatal attack by a doggo argentino. And despite all this, the biggest reason that this animal is one of the most dangerous is that dogs can become easily infected by the rabies virus. Even though rabies can infect other animals, 99% of rabies bites and infection comes from dogs. The virus immediately attacks the brain and is fatal once symptoms appear. Most of the attacks occur in Asia and Africa among poor rural communities, and there is one fatal occurrence every 15 minutes. When it comes to snakes, there is no question that the black mamba is probably the most dangerous snake on the planet. And while you might think that the reason it's so dangerous is that of its poison, while it's true that the venom of this snake is extremely poisonous, it's not the main reason that this snake is so dangerous. It's the fact that this snake can move fast. Thankfully, this snake isn't all over the place and can only be found in the savannas and rocky areas in southern and eastern Africa. But if you go on a safari, better keep your eyes open. This snake is aggressive and can grow up to 14 feet long. It is the fastest of all snakes and can literally chase you down, slithering at speeds up to 12.5 miles per hour. If one of these snakes decides to chase you for whatever reason, such as guarding its nest or territory, the odds of the snake catching you is good, because escaping one in a remote area is difficult. If there is any good thing about them, is that they will only chase you down if you threaten them. But if you do manage to make one angry, and it attacks, and bites you, the snake has a tendency to bite not just once, but repeatedly. And while doing this will deliver enough venom to fatally poison 10 full-grown people. If you do not receive an antivenom within 20 minutes of being bitten by a black mamba, it's adios muchachos, as the bite is 100% fatal. The interesting thing about the black mamba is the snake isn't black at all. It gets its name because the inside of its mouth is completely black. But the black mamba isn't the only snake that is dangerous, of course. Even as it tops the list of the most dangerous snakes, venomous snakes account for over 100,000 fatalities each year. This puts them close to the top for being the most dangerous. Some will comment, humans are the most dangerous animals, and you might be right. The total fatalities from wars alone are estimated to be between 150 million and 1 billion, give or take a few hundred million for early wars that weren't recorded. Humans pose a threat to every living animal on the planet because we have arguably accelerated global warming with the destruction of coral reefs, and many large forests in the world have been decimated. Most animals are forced from their forest homes as we cut down trees, or marine animals perish from all the plastic that we put into the oceans and seas. Not to mention, we have the ability to completely annihilate the entire planet with the most horrifying weapons of all time, including thermonuclear devices and genetically modified superbugs. There is no question that we are one of the most dangerous animals on the planet. And despite this, you might be in for a surprise. The most dangerous animal in the world is the mosquito. You might be wondering how it is possible that a 3mm animal, the common mosquito, which is even tinier than a tsetse fly, could rank as the most dangerous animal on the planet. But the facts are in, and there are reported 725,000 human fatalities each year. These pesky bugs are responsible for the most animal-related fatalities. There are over 3,500 known species of mosquito in the world, and they carry a large variety of diseases like malaria, encephalitis, elephantiasis, yellow fever, dengue fever, West Nile virus, and the newly discovered Zika virus, the mosquito-borne disease which affects unborn children. Mosquitoes can easily spread disease from one person to another person, and malaria by itself is responsible for more than half of all mosquito-related fatalities, which was predominant in sub-Saharan Africa. And although it's on the decline, dengue fever is the leading cause of hospitalization among children in some Asian and Latin American countries. In Canada, they have another unique problem with mosquitoes. Animals are sometimes attacked in deep forests by swarms of mosquitoes, and the animal ends up running from the blood-sucking creatures and onto busy highways and roads. Dangerous animal vehicle collisions happen when an animal tries to escape being bitten heavily in wooded areas next to the highway. The common house mosquito that you encounter in the USA, Europe, and Asia can carry Japanese encephalitis, meningitis, and West Nile virus. There is a subspecies of this mosquito called the London underground mosquito that has adapted to living underground in subway systems and prefers to feed on rats, mice, and of course, humans. The yellow fever mosquito is one of the most widespread species, and its distribution is growing. Other species, like the Asian tiger mosquito, which carries yellow fever, dengue fever, chikungunya fever, filariasis, is considered to be in the top most invasive species in the world, and in the next 20 years could triple in distribution and flood urban areas where humans are plentiful and easy to bite. An interesting thing to note is that only the female mosquitoes bite, and of these, only half carry the parasites known to cause fatal diseases. So if you get bitten by a mosquito, your chances of becoming ill from one of these diseases are rare. However, the World Health Organization has said that more than half of the entire human population is currently at risk from mosquito-borne disease. The big question being asked now is, should we use some eradication techniques to completely wipe them out, or should we let nature deal with things as intended? Let us know what you think in the comments. We hope you enjoyed this video. Let us know which one of these you think is the most dangerous animal in the comments. And don't forget that if you want to be the first to know when we release a new video, make sure to click subscribe and enable notifications. We appreciate you and want to thank you for watching.